Preparing to live stream a webinar.
There you go. We're off. We're off
I
to the
think
races.
we're live. So let's record the webinar and let's make a start. Hello and
Let-
welcome to this week's Ask a webinar. Tailscaler office hours. Lee?
Hey, thank you everybody for joining. Thanks for the introduction, Alex. We have renamed this webinar from Ask a Solutions Engineer to Ask a Tailscaler. So the same format. You come to us with questions. We do our best to answer them. It's me and Alex this week, and we're looking forward to seeing all the great questions. We've already got some ahead of time. I love ahead of time questions because it means I actually got to prepare for them rather than just make stuff up on the top of my head, which is always useful. Before we get started, the usual housekeeping. Respect is the name of the game here. When you're talking in the chat, please be respectful to each other, be respectful to us. This is live. We like to keep it casual. We like to keep it conversational so that if you're expecting the usual buttoned up professional type webinar, you aren't going to get it here. Alex and I are just going to have fun and answer questions. If I
Yeah.
decide to do an ad lib demo or Alex decides to do an ad lib demo, please be patient with us. It may go wrong because we haven't prepared for it. And finally, this webinar is obviously designed for you to ask questions. So the success and the enjoyment that you get out of it depends on the questions that you send us. But please try and ask those questions if you're in the Zoom chat to ask them in the Q&A section so that we can keep track of them. And then Alex does a really wonderful job of following along in the YouTube comments with the chat. We get a lot of questions usually. If we don't get a chance to get to yours, we really apologize. We only have an hour. So we'll try and do our best to get through them. But you know, with that, let's probably get started. What do you say, Alex?
Absolutely. So our first question in the Zoom Q&A today comes in from Craig Hesling. Thank you, Craig. There's a few in there from you, so we'll kind of pepper those throughout the opening few minutes here. So first of all, thanks for all the great work on Tailscale. I've been really enjoying it. That being said, I would enjoy it a lot more if I could use a custom domain name instead of relying on a ts.net domain name. Can you please add this feature?
Um, the answer I think is probably best answered from our product team. However, there's a couple things to bear in mind here around why we have to do the ts.net domains. One of the features of Tailscale is the ability to use things like Tailscale Funnel, which will automatically provision you a bunch of TLS certificates so that you can serve content into the wider internet if you so desire. And in order to do that, we use Let's Encrypt to initiate to provide a certificate. And therefore, we need to have the ability to set DNS records for that domain. And that is why all of the subdomains are under the ts.net domain, because that is something that we are able to kind of add the verification records for the TLS certificate. There is a potential addition in the future of adding vanity ts.net domains. But again, it will be a subdomain of ts.net. I would love to hear the use cases that we would like to see for true vanity domains. Like I use lbr.ts.net and I have an lbrlabs.com. I would love to hear what the use case would be for those true vanity domains. We would likely have to turn off funnel. But
I
you know,
can
the
I can
use
give you
cases
one.
there would, yeah, go on then. I would love to hear it.
I can give you one. It's Jellyfin because streaming
Uh,
video is incredibly bandwidth intensive. So actually on the YouTube channel over the last few weeks, I think it was released in the beginning half of September. I released a video talking about infrastructure as code principles and spinning up Tailscale on a DigitalOcean droplet and then installing a reverse proxy onto that droplet and then using Tailscale as the backend fabric to reverse proxy back to Jellyfin running behind your residential firewall or wherever it might be. The benefits of that are that I can use my own custom domain, and this is running on a droplet. So in terms of cost, it's $5-ish a month. It's fairly minimal. And of course, you can use that droplet for anything else you want to use it for as well. But like Lee was saying, there's a lot of technical reasons which we won't get into today as to why we have made the decision to use ts.net. And they're almost all related to TLS related decisions. Because when you're providing a certificate, the entire purpose of that trust chain is to verify that you are speaking to who you think you're speaking to. And if we were to start breaking out of that sandbox of ts.net, we end up in a potentially limitless world of regressions and edge cases and yada 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 that we could absolutely engineer this. And I know that our engineering teams have thought about it, because one of my first questions when I started at Tailscale was, hey, why don't we support custom domains? So that's why I've put so much effort in the YouTube channel into giving you a workaround, like a workable workaround of that VPS option, or some kind of self-hosted reverse proxy that lets you use your DNS challenges with Let's Encrypt to talk to your DNS, verification, like Cloudflare or whoever it might be. So there's some history in that
Yeah.
answer, I'm afraid, but
I
never
think
say never. But right now,
I,
not
I
happening.
certainly don't see it on the roadmap. I do think it's worth pointing out as well, right? Like if you have a domain name that you want to use, you can always add the Tailscale CGNAT addresses to that DNS provider and just leverage it that way. You just don't get the magic DNS capabilities. But if you want to, you can totally just say, in your DNS provider that the address for your Jellyfin host is, um, jellyfin.mycooldomain.com IP address here. And that is totally possible. It's just outside of the automation and the magic that Tailscale gives you by default. So you'd have to do that manually, basically.
Right. See, that speaks to one of the sort of core principles of Tailscale, really, I think, Lee, is that we try and obfuscate, or what's the word I'm looking for? Abstract is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
We try and abstract away a lot of the complexity so it kind of feels a bit like magic. And every time you offer users an extra knob or an extra dial to turn, the complexity on the back end, I know you don't care about this, but like the complexity on the back end increases exponentially every time you do that. And I hope that answers your question. So we have a question. This one came in ahead of time from Trules, who's actually in the Zoom chat as well. I'd like to ask for a tip on how to set up a site-to-site VPN. For example, we'd like everyone in this group to access intranet.example.com or git.example.com, and another group can access security.example.com. In addition, we'd like to know how we can have a static IP address or something we know our employees are visiting client websites. For example, we have a client website called university.com, but right now we are working a lot with it. We'd like to use Tailscale's IPv4 or something so we can exclude this visit or affect client analytics and statistics when Tailscale's turned on. And Lee, I'm sure you've done some fastidious prep on this one.
I drew a diagram. That's what I did. I
Oh,
like
here we go.
if you send the question ahead of time, I get to draw terrible diagrams. So let me quickly share my screen. So this site-to-site VPN stuff comes up all the time. And I thought it's time to do a little hastily thrown together diagram in Excalidraw to kind of showcase what is needed to make a site-to-site VPN work. Now, hopefully everyone can see my scene. Alex, hopefully it's in reasonable resolution.
Yeah, looks good to me.
Excellent. So what we have here is two sites, A and B, obviously, and then there's a subnet router in each one of those sites that's advertising the address space for the site that we have, the CIDR block for the site. Now, this might be your home, it might be an AWS VPC, it might be a data center, but ultimately the subnet router's job here is to advertise this address space here, right? Which you can see with these arrows here. So subnet router B is advertising 192.168.0.1, and I missed the slash, but it's advertising it to the rest of the tailnet. And subnet router A is doing the same job. It's advertising the 172.16.0.1 address space to the rest of the tailnet. The problem is these LAN devices here, they do not know about this route. They're not aware of it because they don't have Tailscale installed on them. Now, the easiest way to solve this problem is to install Tailscale on all these LAN devices, if that's an option that you have available to you. So if it's generally just compute that you can install Tailscale directly on, if you install it on all these clients, you're effectively creating a site-to-site VPN, but all the clients are managing the routes themselves via the Tailscale client, which is easy. The problem there is like there may be devices within each one of these sites, whether it's in AWS and it has an RDS instance or something along those lines, or whether it's your home and it's a security camera where you can't actually install Tailscale directly on that particular device. So what do you need to do? Well, what you need to do is make this LAN device aware of the routes for this particular site, right? So the way that you would do that really does depend on the infrastructure you have at your house or in your actual VPC or something along those lines. But the essential way that you do that is that you say, if you need a route, and I'm going to quickly draw here for 192.168.0.1/24, route it through the subnet router. So any route here that needs to go to this remote site, it needs to go through the subnet router, which is already aware of this route for this place here. So in a home environment, you're likely going to want to make changes to your Wi-Fi router or something along those lines. If you have a Wi-Fi router that isn't particularly sophisticated, that might be pretty difficult. So step one there would be upgrade your router to have something that is more switch-based. In AWS, this is really easy to do. You simply update the route table to say any request for this IP address block should go through the subnet router's ENI interface to the remote site. There's a couple of caveats that you really need to bear in mind here. The first is that like you don't get any capabilities of Tailscale's ACL mechanism. You are piping unencrypted traffic from A to B, right? So this section here is unencrypted. This section here would be encrypted. That's something to bear in mind. ACLs will generally not apply as well. But that's the way that a site-to-site VPN works, and the way that like you kind of want to set this up. My recommendation is always, if you can install Tailscale on these LAN devices, do that. It will get you the best experience. If you have a bunch of devices that you can't do that, whatever is controlling the network in each one of these sites needs to add those routes through there. So I'll stop there. Alex, do you think there's anything I need to elaborate on there or anything that missed?
Not at all. This is a question that comes up all the time, specifically around non-Tailscale devices routing over a Tailnet fabric. And it really all just comes down to routing always. Like what static routes do you publish and that kind of thing. I think you did a good job explaining that one. So going to move on to another question here from Satish. On looking at our VPC flow logs for the Tailscale EC2, we found that it's doing a DNS lookup for an IP we don't recognize in a 162 dot CIDR. Is this DNS resolver belonging to Tailscale? If not, what may that be? And apparently, Satish checked in, and I see this in the Zoom live chat right here. Apparently, that IP belongs to Cloudflare. So what's going on there?
I am not aware of us doing any lookups on a 162 address with the Tailscale infrastructure. I'm just quickly looking up the if it's 169, I thought it might be in a PIPA address, like a local automatic private address.
Yeah, that
But
was
I
my
am not
first
aware
thought
of
too.
I'm not aware of any 169 address. So if you send us the full address and do it via a support ticket, we can dig into that a little bit more. But there's certainly not anything that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I thought this one was a bit strange too. So maybe there's just some rogue service doing a rogue DNS lookup on your network, or maybe there's a service, a hosted service that's being proxied through Cloudflare somewhere. I don't know. There's a lot of things it could be, and it's almost always DNS related. So,
Hmm.
all right, let's move on to a YouTube question. This one comes in from Scott, and he says, I've just built a NAS with Open Media Vault installed, and I'm running some shares on it. Is there a way to use Tailscale to share my files with others over the internet without anybody having to install an app?
I'm going to leave that one to you, Alex. I think that is definitely in your wheelhouse.
Well, I mean, the official answer, I suppose, it's still in alpha, but Tail Drive is a feature that lets you access files on a remote server using WebDAV. It's still, like I say, really early days with Tail Drive, but that lets you control through ACLs access to certain files on certain hosts and that kind of thing. And that will be the answer in the long term. The short-term answer for right now is you can share Samba or NFS directly over your Tailnet. if you type, in a Mac, for example, you do the connector server, you do SMB colon / 100 dot whatever for your Tailscale's IP address, it'll just work. It might be a bit slow, but it'll work. What you might find is a better option, Scott, is to self-host an application that presents your file system as a front end. So you could just host a simple Nginx web server with auto index turned on just to list the directory contents if that's what you want. Alternatively, you could do something like File Stash or Nextcloud, or there's a thousand different options. I'd highly advise you to go and take a look at the awesome self-hosted list of applications over on GitHub, and that should give you some food for thought on the types of applications, web apps that you can run, typically in a container that would have access to your local file system and share that out over your tailnet just as another web app. Okay, good deal. So let's jump back to another Zoom question. This one comes in from Daniel. I have some PCs with Tailscale installed, and these PCs are currently deployed at a customer's facility connected to their Wi-Fi network. The PC is unable to complete any inbound, outbound traffic to my Tailscale network. I can't SSH into that PC, for example. Everything works fine when I use a different Wi-Fi network, though. So how can I troubleshoot this with my customer's IT team? Are there any specific settings on the Tailscale side that I need to enable or disable?
Yeah, I can take this one. So Tailscale, the first thing to check is that the Tailscale client is like connected in the console, right? And that is an indication that the Tailscale client is able to reach the control plane, which is kind of the ultimate arbiter of whether it's got connectivity. If it does have that connectivity, the next step is to look at the logs on the Tailscale client and verify there's no error messages there. My suspicion on this is that outbound UDP traffic is restricted because the way that Tailscale creates connections between clients is it tries to send a UDP message to our stun servers, which are the dirt relays, to let everybody know what the endpoints are, like everybody in the tailnet. And if you can't do anything with this inbound, outbound traffic for Tailscale, my guess is that UDP traffic is restricted. It is also possible that you updated your ACLs and it can't connect because the ACLs, like I've done this multiple times. I did a webinar a few months ago where I was like in the middle of a demo and I was like, why can't I connect to my Tailscale? And somebody was like, you remove the default ACL. And I was like, oh, that'll definitely do it. So you could also check that you haven't implemented any ACLs within Tailscale that stop it from communicating. But my suspicion here is verifying that UDP outbound traffic is available. You don't necessarily need UDP inbound traffic because Tailscale's relays will actually then tunnel traffic over TCP once it can create that connectivity. But you definitely, at a bare minimum, need UDP outbound traffic. If you send the device name and identifier to our support team, who are wonderful, they will be able to verify that it has the settings that it needs there. But my guess is that you probably want to check with your customer's IT team if they are restricting outbound traffic via a proxy or something along those lines.
A second question from Daniel, which is kind of related, I think, and might be indicative of some issues, like you say, talking to the control server. Occasionally, my Tailscale machine ID hostname doesn't resolve, but the IP address works just fine. Typically, a quick Tailscale up and down fixes the issue on Linux. I think listening to everything Lee just said about making sure you can reach the coordination servers on the Tailscale side correctly, we publish a full list on our website of all the stuff you need to absolutely make sure is whitelisted in your firewall if you're running into these issues in a restricted environment. But yeah, I just echo everything Lee's just said, particularly around UDP. We always forget about UDP because it's just silently being awesome in the background, but Tailscale relies on it pretty heavily.
Yeah, just an additional thing on the Linux client as well, right? You have to accept DNS explicitly on the Linux client, and you also need to make sure that nothing else is modifying the resolve.conf. So
Mm,
Tailscale will,
great
by
point.
default, when you do accept DNS, update your resolve.conf to be able to resolve those host names. There are lots of other processes in Linux that will modify your resolve.conf and kind of overwrite those things. So this is actually a conversation we're having internally in engineering right now. Like, there's a great blog post. Like, let me see if I can find it. Uh, about the trials and tribulations of updating and managing DNS, which is all the way back from 2021. And guess what? It's still not a solved problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the other thing to bear in mind, because what I'm suspecting here is when you do the Tailscale down up, it rewrites the resolve.conf, and therefore it's now correct again. So I would check that nothing's messing with it, basically.
Yeah, it makes me think of the IT crowd. Have you tried turning it off and on again?
I have that
Seriously.
literal quote on my wall up here. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay,
Yeah, I
I'll ask
mean,
the next question if that's all right, Alex. Oh, sorry, didn't mean
yeah,
to interrupt you.
absolutely. Go for it. Yeah.
This one is something that's quite interesting because again, I always think these things are serendipitous. Like you think about it once a couple of weeks ago, and then you feel like it comes up all the time. That's probably recency bias. But this particular question from an anonymous attendee is something that I was dealing with another customer, so I think it's interesting. In the scenario common for us that our partners' clients have very restricted outbound access, how can I configure Tailscale to connect to my Tailnet? What do I need to tell the vendors, partners, clients to configure their firewall? I know this resource exists, but this is too open. I need to restrict it anymore. Is hosting my own derp server the best way forward? Please assist.
There's also a question in the YouTube live chat talking about self-hosted derp servers. So let's just talk a little bit about what a relay server, a derp server is for. Can you remember what the acronym stands for?
No, I can look it
Nor
up
can
real
I.
quick.
It's something to do,
Distributed, it's and think relay or something, right? Like,
right.
I'm gonna look it up real
Relay
quick. But
proxy, essentially.
yes.
So whenever possible, Tailscale will attempt to establish a direct device-to-device connection. Now, if you attended Lee's webinar a couple of weeks ago talking about client connectivity being demystified, he covered some of the basics around how the NAT traversal stuff of Tailscale actually works behind the scenes. We use these derp relay servers to act as a kind of like middleman in that initial discovery phase, or indeed if a client is behind a particularly difficult hard NAT situation, as is sometimes the case in places like AWS, for example. Those relay servers are they're a trusted endpoint. I think it's fair to say for most people, but we appreciate that in enterprise environments or in certain privacy respecting environments, you want to self-host this stuff. That's cool. That's fine. So we offer the ability for you to be able to self-host your own relay servers to act as that kind of middleman. Now, in terms of that process, it's quite involved. It's not, it's not for beginners. It's a very advanced topic. And we do have some documentation on that topic as well if you're interested. But from that perspective, I think it's one of those things that like if you know you need it, like you need it. It's one of those need to know basis type questions.
Yeah. For lots of customers have asked me, I want to run my own server. Can you tell me how to do it? And I will tell them I have tried to run my own derp server and it didn't go very well. So, there's expertise on our engineering team that far surpasses my ability to kind of keep a production system live. Um, the only thing that hosting your own derp server will really give you is the ability to whitelist an outbound port that you know and can predict, right? I think there is another um, part of our enterprise tier that we do not advertise for very, very good reasons. And the enterprise feature is you can actually set Tailscale to only use port 443 outbound as a communication mechanism. So that will turn off all stun packets. It will turn off all outbound UDP. You will have a performance impact here. This is something that will affect the ability for you to kind of put high throughput through, and you'll always use our relay servers. The reason that this is in place is because most organizations will allow outbound TLS traffic pretty liberally. So if that's something you want to explore, this first step is to contact our sales team, and you can do that at sales@tailscale.com. Again, it's an enterprise feature. So this is not something that is available to personal users and starter users. It's really designed for enterprise support. And the reason for that is it's really a complicated way of running the product, and you need kind of our help to be able to do it properly. So summary, please don't run your own derp servers unless you really, really need to. And if you really, really don't want to run your own derp server, but you need to restrict outbound traffic, there is a feature flag that's very, very that's kind of the last resort situation here. So anonymous attendee, if that's something that's interesting to you, reach out to our sales team, sales@Tailscale.
Is it possible? Yes. Is it a good idea? I feel like Jeff Goldblum over here. They were so
Yes.
obsessed with whether they could, they didn't stop
Yeah.
to think whether they, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. Luz7 writes on YouTube, should I be running a mini PC or an Apple TV as an exit node, and which is more stable?
I think this is very subjective, so why don't we both give our version?
Yeah.
I'll let you go first.
Oh, come on.
Okay, I'll
All
go
right.
first. Fine, that's
Yeah,
fine.
go
Fine.
on.
I personally would I personally run the Tailscale subnet router for my home on my router. But if you don't have that capability, like I run it on my Unify device, which I think we have another question about that, so that would be a good segue. But I run it on my Unify device because it's up all the time and it's a small Linux PC. It has a Debian package manager, but I think that kind of meets the small device thing. Ultimately, what you're really looking for is something that's always on and has reasonable performance, right? And then like a Unify device kind of met that for me. If I didn't have that, I would probably buy a Raspberry Pi and stick that on my network somewhere, rather than my Apple TV. What about you, Alex?
Yeah, Apple TV. I mean, so I actually run multiple exit nodes in this same LAN. I've got one running on OpenSense as my edge device, as like my firewall device. And then I've also got it running on my Apple TV. Why not? It consumes, I think I measured it when I made a video for the YouTube channel. It consumes, I think, zero point 0.4 watts at idle. Like that's basically nothing. And it's always on all the time. And we all know Apple devices are pretty hard to tinker with, which sometimes is a bear, but sometimes is a feature, particularly when it
Yeah.
comes to something you want to rely on, like subnet routing or being an exit node. You just want it to always be on and always be working. And for me, the Apple TV fits that bill pretty nicely. What I would say is if you are doing some more advanced things with, SNAT and a bunch of other stuff, like again, if you know you need some of these features, you probably already selected a mini PC or a Raspberry Pi like Lee has. Um, there are some architectural limitations to doing it on Apple TV just by virtue of it being a 10-foot interface as opposed to being a command line interface. So let's segue into Scott's Unify question whilst we're over in the Unify corner. He says, I've recently migrated our business network over to Unify. I'm trying to set up a VPN for our employees to access our network to run applications and files from remote locations. I've created a WireGuard VPN, but now I can't access our Windows network resources. Can Tailscale help with this? I'm using SonicWall and the client works easily.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, right? Like, absolutely, it will allow your users to connect to applications and files remotely. The Unify itself has a VPN in there, which is I have personally used before I used Tailscale, and it caused me a whole bunch of problems. So you can approach this in a couple of different ways, really, depending on the infrastructure that you have behind the Unify network. Sounds like you got a Windows domain controller. You can install Tailscale directly on that Windows domain controller. You can install it on the Unify device and create a subnet router. Or you can, have some dedicated infrastructure behind that Unify network that kind of runs Tailscale. But I think the short answer is absolutely yes. Tailscale will allow users to connect to applications and files remotely over an encrypted tunnel. So you know that it's secure and you know that it's safe. And you can also set up like logical separation for your users so that they can only access the things that they need to access using our ACL mechanism. So I would highly recommend taking a look, Scott. Any additional thoughts, Alex?
Well, not a thought per se, but Brian Scott in the YouTube live chat actually asked a follow-up question, which dovetails really nicely into what we're talking about here. He says, I have a Ubiquiti network with 4 separate VLANs, one for home, IoT, kids, etc. Seems like I would need to have 4 separate subnet routers in one in each VLAN. Or can I do one subnet router that advertises all of these subnets all at once?
Yes, you can have a subnet router that advertises multiple subnets. It's worth pointing out that VLANs are a layer 2 construct, right? So like that is in the OSI model, a VLAN is a logical separation at layer 2. whereas the subnet is a layer 3 address. So what you will need to do when you put your subnet router somewhere in those VLANs is give it permission to be able to actually communicate with all the other VLANs. It's been 10 years since I did any network design, Alex, so I'm kind of like digging pretty deep here, but you
Well,
will need to have some sort of like communication between those VLANs, but all you need to do is pass the different subnets and it will just work.
it's just routing at the end of the day. So you showed a diagram a few minutes ago of how different devices can reach out over different routes, right? And essentially, so long as this is basically what Lee was saying, so long as the subnet router is in a subnet or a VLAN that has permission to route into the other ones, typically that would be your management VLAN or something like your most permissive one where your workstation lives or something like that. As long as it can reach out to the other subnets and has a routable, route, but there isn't like network isolation turned on in the Unify console, should be pretty much good to go. So
Yeah.
let us know how that works, because actually that could be a really interesting video idea. Thank you
I
for
agree.
that one.
Speaking of interesting video ideas, Bertrand has a request in the form of a question, which my favorite type of Q&A here. First of all, it says, Alex, your videos are awesome, which I think we all definitely agree with. Would it be possible for you to make a detailed video on how to set up N8N self-hosted AI starter kit with Tailscale, Caddy and Cloudflare on a VPS for beginners? This project encompasses a lot of moving parts, Postgres, DB, Olama, and it would be great exposure to Tailscale for the huge N8N community, which has nearly 50K stars on GitHub. Alex, what does your YouTube video schedule look like over the next few months?
Well, we've got a bunch of stuff coming up. We're launching a partnership with Unraid in the next couple of weeks, so there'll be some Unraid content coming there. Tailscale is going to be shipping natively as part of the Unraid product now, so you won't need a plugin to remotely access your Unraid box, which is super cool if you ask me. We've got a few more Tailscale explained videos coming too on some of the like more advanced ACL topics and a bunch of other stuff, which obviously just keep an eye on the feeds and you'll get that delivered to you. With regards to AI stuff and N8N in particular, um, I haven't used it at all, if I'm being perfectly honest. I'm aware of its existence and it's kind of on my list of things to figure out one day. So, Bertrand, knowing that there's an audience already pre-waiting of at least one person who would be interested in this video, I'm happy to add that to my backlog for you. What I would say is that you can probably replace the N8N stuff. Like there's a lot of the prerequisites that are already done in your question with regards to spinning up Caddy with Tailscale and using Cloudflare for DNS on a VPS. That's already covered in the Jellyfin video that was released in September. There's a lot of infrastructure as code stuff in there that you can reuse with Terraform and Ansible to configure a lot of that stuff out of the box for you. The main difference, of course, would be that instead of running Jellyfin, you're running N8N. So yeah, we'll definitely take a look at that one. No promises because I've literally never even used it. I just know it exists. But thanks for writing in.
Excellent answer as always. Do you have resources, professional services to help with enterprise implementation? Hi, that's my job. So yes, we absolutely do. We would love to hear more about your use case and we'd love to hear more about what you are trying to do. There is a contact form which our trusty helper Tim has been posting in the chat a couple of times, which is the contact sales form. I can add it here. Let's have a look. I can add it. Here we are. And this will get right to our sales team, and we can have a conversation about your use case and what you are trying to achieve, and then we can likely also help you achieve that. I will say, as a former DevOps engineer, site reliability engineer, I had to deal with SaaS sales teams and used to dread it. I have been on lots and lots of sales call on the other side of the fence, and most organizations are like, I don't want to talk to sales, just give me help. I think our sales team are excellent at making sure that we drive down to what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to, what the end result needs to be. So please don't be afraid of having a conversation with us. There'll usually be a solutions engineer on the call who is a technical resource that you can use. So I look forward to having a conversation, but yes, we can absolutely help you do that.
So, a quick time check. We're about halfway through the webinar here, and we've got maybe 3 or 4 questions in the queue ahead of us. So if you want to drop your questions either in the Zoom chat, please make sure you're using the Q&A section over on Zoom, or if you're in YouTube, of course, just use the live chat and I'll pick those up. So there's a question here from Brian, which came through on YouTube. What's the best setup for supporting other tailnets with friends, clients, and family? Is node sharing the best option, or should I be managing multiple accounts for each of these people?
What do you think? I'm actually going to defer to you there because I haven't done a whole bunch of node sharing stuff. So, I have some ideas, but I would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, let's take a use case, for example. The new version of Factorio is coming out some point in October. So I'm readying myself for a new release of Factorio because I've got like 1,000 hours in that game. It's an unhealthy obsession of mine. And occasionally I want to play multiplayer, but I don't really want to put this thing on the public internet. I just want to share it with a couple of buddies, and it's a very simple process of doing so in Tailscale. Like they need a Tailscale account and they need a tailnet of their own. I do a node share of the either the Docker container or the actual VM that's running the workload in the Tailscale console. I send them a URL, they click the link, and it just adds that node as a shared node into their tailnet, and they can route traffic to it, and all is good. Where it becomes a bit more complex is where you're wanting to do, let's take Jellyfin as the example here, or an audiobook player or something, and you want to share it with your partner, a kid, a grandparent, for photo backup or audiobooks or something like that. It becomes more tricky to walk some of those less technical folks through. We make it as easy as we can with Tailscale, I think, but it still becomes there's a couple of extra hoops to jump through. So we've just recently launched the Personal Plus tier. So Tailscale has a very generous free tier as it stands with 100 devices for free and 3 users. But we know that a lot of families have more than 3 users in them. So we now have that Personal Plus tier, which takes up to 6 users for, I think it's $5 a month or something like that. So what you can do is create a single tailnet with up to 6 users for that $5 nominal fee. And you can, when you've done that, manage those users directly in that tailnet to give them access. And then all they do is log into the tailnet on their phone or laptop or wherever. And then you're good to go. So really, it's selecting the right tool for the job. If it's a quick and dirty share with a friend, node sharing is perfect. If it's a more long-term situation where you want to have say you've got a self-hosted image photo backup. If it's a long-term situation, then I'd probably look at some of our Personal Plus plans or something like that. Um, Anything to add?
No, I think that was excellent. The thing that I like on the enterprise side, my enterprise mind is always thinking about like the separation boundaries that you want to create, right? And so with node sharing, you're ultimately allowing a users in other tailnets to be able to access something within your kind of secure infrastructure. And with if you have a tailnet where everybody has the same email address or like email addresses that you trust and they can access the whole tailnet, that's absolutely fine too. Once you start to talk about things like I want multiple people to be able to access, like the public internet and a whole bunch of other stuff, then your trust boundary has basically disappeared, right? And at that point, I don't think Tailscale is the right solution there because it is creating a trusted network. And you really want to kind of think about where your trust boundary is when you start thinking about how you're going to share these things. Um, even in a personal capacity. I personally would advocate getting people signed up and installing the Tailscale client because it creates an element of trust. But that's just my kind of like personal approach, I would say.
Yeah, horses, different strokes for different folks, right? When it comes to this, a lot of it will come down to your personal threat model and how you view the people you're sharing certain things with. I mean, on my Telnet, for example, I've got all of my most precious data right alongside my Apple TV, right alongside a bunch of other stuff, and I don't want to share some of that stuff with strangers. Now, if you're doing a node share out of the box, at least you're limiting the blast radius to that node itself that you're sharing. You can do things like share the exit node. You can do things like share the subnet route. You can also share SSH over node sharing as well. There are some limitations with tag devices and identity and that kind of thing, which are possibly a bit too advanced for this discussion. But it's just one of those things. Try it. Try 3 different ways. It's all probably testable on the free tiers with what we've got available for free. Try it out. Let us know what works, what doesn't work, and we're always tweaking and making things better moving forward. So like I say, we just launched the Personal Plus in tier in response to feedback we had from the community saying, please, honestly, I and as a human being, like, it's surprising the feedback we get of people saying, please give us a way to give you more money. And I'm like, okay, here we go. Here you go.
On a similar manner, like if you attend a conference and you staff the Tailscale booth, this is the first job I've ever had where people will just line up to tell you how awesome the product is, which I think is
Yeah.
very validating. But also, I think, the the ability to for us to solve your problems has been very eye-opening to me, and the fact that we do it in such a straightforward way is really awesome. So I'm glad to hear that people want to give us money and tell us how awesome our product is.
Speaking of conferences, at the end of the month, you and I are both going to be at All Things Open, right? In Raleigh.
That's right, yeah. I'm actually going on a bit of a conference roadshow over the next couple months. So
Uh-oh.
if you wanna meet myself and Alex in person at All Things Open, we have a happy hour as well, I believe, right?
We do,
That we
and the raffle prize arrived. This is a look at this
I
bad
think
boy.
I need to win that. Am I allowed to win that? Is that okay?
Look at this thing.
Uh,
So if you're going to be at All Things Open in Raleigh, which is at the end of the month, I think off the top of my head, it's like 26th, 27th, 28th of
that
October,
sounds right. Yeah.
something like that. Come see myself and Lee. There'll be a Tailscale happy hour in conjunction with Unraid Trophy Brewing. Stop by the booth, come say hi, enter the raffle. You might win the Lego Space Shuttle.
And other conferences, I'll be at KubeCon in November in Salt Lake City. We'll have a Tailscale booth there. But if you want to talk Kubernetes and Tailscale, I will be there along with a bunch of other super talented Tailscale folks. And then we have what I think is probably the biggest conference of the year, AWS reInvent, which is very late in the year this year because the Thanksgiving is so late. But that's the 2nd to the 6th, and we'll have a big presence at reInvent as well. So if you like this format and want to ask us these questions in person, then come and drop by the booth at one of those 3 events, and especially in Raleigh, because we will both be there, which will be very exciting.
Giving talks as well. I hope you're taking your vitamin C in advance of reInvent, by the way.
I am indeed. I mean, 1 week, 5 days of Vegas is a lot of Vegas, I'm
It's
telling
a lot
you.
of Vegas. Yeah.
It's not. I look forward to it because of the ability to meet different customers and talk about what Tailscale can do. But by Friday, I'm like, get me the hell out of this city.
Get me out of Dodge.
So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely a long week for sure.
All right, let's get back to the task at hand, shall we? As a question came in on YouTube from RMKR. Is it possible to use Tailscale to forward traffic from specific ports to another node? For example, when I'm hosting something locally, but with a remote cloud front-end node, like your Jellyfin example referring to the YouTube video. So I'm using IP table entries right now to forward 2 specific ports to the externally visible remote node across Tailscale.
Not very hard trying visualizing that. Are you like what ports are we forwarding? It's a little difficult to for me to grok that, I think. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, by default, Tailscale's ACLs are deny all. So first thing first would be to make sure that your ACLs have a permissive rule which permit the traffic to flow on the port from the source to the destination. After that, I think it's just going to be a case of making sure that the things are running on the correct ports on the target host, and then locking it down from there. I'm with Lee on this one. I'm not totally sure what you're using the IP table entries for. It's a little bit of a confusing question, I think. So
And if I try and work my way through this like logically, there's 2 reasons you would have any IP tables rules. The first is you want to be able to restrict inbound access to something, and you are opening it up via IP tables, which makes sense. And then there's the idea that you might want to You have something on the machine that is sending outbound traffic to something, and you want to masquerade the ports for some reason. Like that's something that I think you might want to do. If that's the case, then it's probably a little trickier. But with with inbound stuff, I think Alex is spot on with the ACLs, but I think we might need more information there. I think we probably need a little bit more insight into what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, there's a comment from Truls in the Zoom webinar chat asking if you can set a call up about this one. Are you referring to what we're talking about right now with the traffic from specific ports? I'm a little confused. So in the
Yeah.
Zoom chat, uh, Truls, we need a little bit more clarification. All right, so Anon writes in this scenario, which is common for us, that our partners and client have very restricted outbound access. How can I configure Tailscale to connect to my tailnet? What are the various resources and documentation you have available for explicit firewall documentation?
Think we covered this a little earlier, right?
We did, yeah.
And just to kind of reiterate, Tailscale needs outbound connectivity on UDP to send information about its endpoints to DERP servers. If you're not able to allow that, we do have an enterprise feature which allows you to pipe all traffic through port 443, which is very a case of last resort. So if that's something that you're interested in, see the contact form that Tim has been diligently posting in the chat, and let's have a conversation on the sales side. But it is something that we do not. It requires some engagement with us to be able to enable that and turn it on.
Yeah, I'm just going to post that sales link, by the way, in the YouTube chat too, just because we've got the YouTube and the Zoom chat going both at the same time. So Nicholas writes, thank you for making it possible to remotely access my Mac home network and Jellyfin safely. I've never felt safe enough to open ports or VNC in my VNC through my firewall before. As an absolute beginner, I've learned what to do with your holiday YouTube video using my Apple TV as an exit node. Any suggestions on where I can go next in my baby steps of learning and how to use Tailscale?
Yes, I think again, I usually defer to your expertise on this kind of stuff. But ultimately the answer here would be once you install Tailscale within that private network, you no longer need to open those kind of ports to the public internet that are super scary. VNC being the one that like I think there's two protocols that immediately make me shudder if I see them on the public internet, and VNC is one of them, and the other one is RDP, right? Like if you
Yeah.
have those two things open, then you're gonna have a bad time, right?
Yep.
And then maybe databases. But Nicholas, I think Alex's videos are an excellent point of call to be able to get started here. The easiest thing that you're going to find is if you install Tailscale directly on Jellyfin or your Plex host, you'll immediately be able to access it from any other client, whether it's your iPhone or your MacBook or your Windows laptop or whatever. You can be able to access that Jellyfin media library via that very, very easily, and it's going to magically automate a bunch of this stuff. Alex, any thoughts?
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, I do a podcast called Self-Hosted. So that's available at selfhosted.show. And I'm aware this is shameless self-promotion on a work thing, but it answers the question pretty nicely. So my friend Chris and I talk a lot on that podcast about just random projects that might pique your interest. And I always tend to recommend that folks that want to get further into the self-hosting rabbit hole solve real problems for themselves. Like in the past, the entry point to self-hosting quite often was media. So we're talking like Plex, Jellyfin type stuff. These days, we've got a whole new entry point into that world with Home Assistant and home automation stuff. Home Assistant is a free and open source home automation platform that can run many, many, many different self-hosted apps as containers or as fully fledged services. So I would just suggest that you find some problems and scratch that itch and just look for even silly stuff that might you might not even think of right away, like how do I convert PDFs? There's a self-hosted app for that called Sterling PDF, and then you can start trying to mature your Docker Compose deployments around that. A bunch of really just small problems that over time you'll solve one by one and reduce your reliance on proprietary services and become a freedom loving open source hippie like myself that solves everything with containers in their basement. So
That's the way to do it. I agree. I'm with you. Okay, we have an excellent question, which also involves me praising our support team. So definitely want to be able to do that. Your support techs were awesome. I agree. What a wonderful team and hardworking team. If you knew the volume of inbound requests that we got and what our support team gets through on a given day, you would all be amazed. So yes, your support techs were awesome. But why can't I speak to a person? Turn an issue that should have taken hours to fix to taking 3+ days? Well, I think the transparent and honest answer here is if we let every single person that wanted to talk to us, we never get any actual work done. Like Zoom calls are incredibly bandwidth intensive from a human capital perspective. So what we do, like most organizations of our scale, is that we prioritize those people who are making our business most successful and most sustainable. So, you know, every customer that is paying over a certain amount of money for the Tailscale enterprise features gets the opportunity to have a Slack channel or a dedicated support conversation and prioritize support. I don't know, anonymous attendee, where you are in our kind of like sales hierarchy, but what we cannot do is offer the ability for every single personal tailnet to, speak to a person because ultimately we just don't have the capacity to do that. What I will say is that I think Tailscale is pretty unique in the sense that if you send a support ticket to support@tailscale.com, it will get a real person on the other end of the line. And considering the number of users that we have, I think that's pretty special and remarkable that we've continued to be able to do that. And again, it is a facet of the amazingness of our support team that that is the case. So I'm glad that we got your problem solved, anonymous attendee. I'm really sorry it took longer than it should have done, but ultimately we are dealing with lots and lots of customers. If anybody on this call really, really wants to have a conversation around dedicated support, dedicated conversations with our support team, with the solutions engineers, as well as our engineering team, please reach out to us via sales and talk about how you can help sustain Tailscale as a business. Because while we offer an amazing product for a very, very competitive price, we are a business, and in order for us to succeed, we need revenue. And so I'm hopeful that everybody here who wants to pay for the Personal Plus plan also wants to go to their boss and say, hey, you know that crappy VPN that everybody hates and doesn't want to use? Why don't we replace that with Tailscale instead? And that's where I can come to help you as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Any thoughts that you want to add on there, Alex?
I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations. I actually was with a chap the other day who said, just go put in, because it was a sales call, and it was like, go put into your company Slack. We're thinking of adopting Tailscale. Who here's heard of it? Who likes it or whatever in your engineering room? And the replies were thankfully few. It was a risky tactic, but thankfully we're all positive and said, yeah, we love it. Just go for it and do it. So nothing really to add there. So another question comes in from on Zoom. By the way, we're entering the last 5 minutes here. So if you have any final questions, I see the one that just came on YouTube about ACL GUIs. We'll come to that one. Put them in the Zoom Q&A or the YouTube live chat, and we'll try and cover them off in the last 5 minutes or so. One question that came in on Zoom from Anonymous was, I've got an IoT device running Linux, Debian 9 in his case, with inside a tailnet with 50 different devices connected. Sometimes it shows connected in the Tailscale console. Sometimes it will time out trying to connect, showing Tailscale encountered an error. Machine may be offline. What are some of the things that, like basic troubleshooting stuff that you would recommend I try?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that the Tailscale D. So there's two components to a Tailscale client. There's the Tailscale like interface, which you use to interact with Tailscale, and that might be the GUI on your Mac or Windows host, or like the CLI on your Linux host. That's where you run Tailscale up. What that does is it communicates with the daemon, the Tailscale D daemon that is on the back end, and that Tailscale D daemon will have error messages that indicate what is happening here. Some guesses. Again, we talked about this earlier. Like Tailscale needs outbound connectivity in order to be able to do its thing. Again, the uniqueness here is that it will only need outbound connectivity. It will reuse those ports when it has UDP outbound connectivity. Um, it may be that you have a proxy or a firewall that is pretty restrictive on outbound traffic. It may be that your daemon is crashing for some reason due to resource exhaustion. Um, the encounter and error isn't super useful. I think we'd love to see some like Tailscale D logs. You can actually run the command, and I would recommend you run this directly from the device you're trying to connect to rather than the device you're trying to connect from. You can run Tailscale bug report, and that will generate a random string, which also includes all a bunch of log data that you can then send to our support team who can start to investigate this. Most of the time I've seen this sort of stuff happen, it is due to outbound connectivity restrictions or the Tailscale D daemon crashing. So that will be my kind of starting point. Um, any other thoughts you have there, Alex? I know you've done a whole bunch of stuff in the Linux space as well.
Yeah, so the firewall kind of outbound stuff that Lee was talking about is absolutely where I would start. Make sure things are explicitly whitelisted if there's any doubt in your mind at all. Uh, Beyond that, it's could be DNS. It could be. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff it could be. If you continue to run into this issue, of course, open a support ticket and we'll work through the details with you with the bug reports like Lee was just talking about. A couple more questions just came through in quick fire on YouTube, so let's try and get through them relatively quickly. Dan Foxley writes, do you guys have any thoughts on a web GUI on the Tailscale website versus JSON? I assume he's referring to the ACL's editor here.
Yes, this is very commonly asked for. I think we definitely have a desire to solve the problem of being able to modify the ACLs in a more kind of um, point and click way. I don't know what the timeline is for that. I don't want to throw our product team under the bus, but it's certainly something that is on our roadmap. I personally think it's a probably a 70-30 split with people who want to be able to modify ACLs. 70% of people want to be able to use the JSON, 30% want to be able to use the GUI. We implemented it in a way that was scalable, right? Like I think doing a bunch of firewall rules via a GUI is less scalable than the JSON file. Would you use a GUI if we had one, Alex, or are you more on the JSON side?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm the sort of chap that likes doing my ACL rules through GitOps, so that probably answers your question.
Yeah.
I actually don't mind editing a config file because clicking my way to victory gets pretty tiring pretty quickly, whereas copying and pasting a config file is one and done. And
Yeah.
the nice thing about a config file as well in the audit logs is you end up with a versioned version of your ACL file, so you can actually roll back and do effectively like a git blame style diff between, well, who changed this rule, what, and write tests in there and a bunch of other stuff too. If you want to know more about ACLs, just released a Tailscale explained video on the main channel talking about the basics of ACLs and writing ACL tests and that kind of thing. Not to say that my preference will influence the direction of the product, of course. We hear this request all the time from our users, and it's one of those things that we know we're going to have to tackle at some point. I know there are plans afoot, but like Lee, we're not yet in a position to talk about sharing them publicly. When we are, trust me, we'll make a big deal of it. DJ Bazzy Wazzy, that's a
Great
fun
name.
name,
Great name.
writes on YouTube, are there any plans for a mobile app for admin console options?
I think if you go to tailscale.com on your on your like web browser on your mobile device, it renders pretty well in the mobile browser. I don't think there's any plans for an app, but you can certainly use the web console via your mobile browser pretty well, and it renders really, really well. So I think, in this world of things transitioning to webified applications, like almost every application that I have open right now is written in some sort of Electron app, which is basically a web application.
Hmm.
I don't think we have any plans to do that, but I could be wrong. What do you think, Alex? Is an app there useful
Yeah.
or?
I'd actually be curious to know the use case where the web console is unavailable in a situation that you would need it. Not to say that it's a bad idea necessarily. It's just one of those things that's never really occurred to me personally before. So yeah, just let us know in the chat why you would want this, and we'll feed that back into the product teams. So we've got 2 minutes left, which means it's time for our final question. I see there's just a few more still filtering in on YouTube and Zoom, but we've only really got time for one more question today. And this comes from Rob de Graaf talking about the MSP program. I'd like to really place Tailscale and resell it as part of an MSP package. What about an MSP program with a central dashboard? Sorry for my bad English. Don't worry about that. It was fine, Rob.
And your English is better than my whatever language you speak. So yeah, I definitely don't can't speak Spanish or any other language. We have an amazing partners team who are set up for helping you be successful with this exact thing. I feel like we've posted the hell out of this contact sales link.
Yes.
But that is the quickest way to talk to our partners team. So we have a dedicated solutions engineer, we have a dedicated account executive, and a dedicated kind of partners liaison that can help with this particular thing. We're making big changes in the product to help with these kind of partner white labeling type things. So I'm really excited. I can't go into too much detail because we're not ready to talk about it yet, but there are changes in the product coming that are really exciting in this particular arena. So please contact us and get in touch with our sales team, and we'll route you to the partnerships team who will be able to talk you through what options we have available.
And no promises as to what is currently available or not for your specific situation, Rob. But a good friend of mine up in Canada runs a small MSP up near Toronto, and he is working with our partnerships team directly on bringing this functionality to the wider Tailscale ecosystem. Just picture a situation where, you've got a car dealership, for example, that wants to do remote backups over a secure link. And then you've got the same thing with the dentist's office and yeah, we hear you loud and clear. It makes a ton of sense for a lot of those smaller businesses to interface directly with their already existing MSP provider, as opposed to having a separate contract with Tailscale. And yeah, we hear you loud and clear. Progress is in progress. Reach out to us and we will make sure that you're updated as part of our MSP list. So I think that will probably do us for today.
My favorite hour of the month is over. I'm very sad. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone's questions. This is really, I really mean it. This is my favorite hour of the month. Just hanging out with Alex and answering questions is the way to spend a Wednesday morning. So thank you everybody for the questions, and thank you for, the engagement. It's really awesome. We look forward to doing it again next month.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, keep an eye on the various social media channels that we have. YouTube, obviously, where I'll be posting regular videos every week or two. We've also started doing on the off weeks in between these webinars, something called Tailscale Talk, which is a much less structured kind of just hang out with me for an hour on the live stream, just to, mess around with. Last week we are doing Proxmox and LXCs, for example. Who knows what it'll be next week, but just keep an eye on the stream. Make sure you got your notifications turned on, all that good stuff on YouTube. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. I've been Alex.
I've been Lee.
Uh,
Thank you so
Ciao
much.
for now.
Ciao for now, indeed.
Thanks, everyone.